board had the opportunity of hearing a brief statement from tonight's speaker, Mr. Joseph Andrews, who is the founder and president of the Center for Teaching the Constitution. Will you please join me in giving Joseph Andrews a warm Long Beach Eagle Forum welcome.
Am I broadcasting now? Excellent, good. Well, gee, I'll try to live up to your wonderful introduction. Thank you very much. My story actually begins also about 12 years ago when I read the Constitution for the first time in my life. I went through, all this public school education, 3 master's degrees, and I was never required to read the founding documents of our country. And so I read it for the first time, and I was never the same after that. And that was the beginning. And then I taught my own children. And not only is it not taught in the grammar schools or high schools, it's not taught in law school. Constitutional law courses do not study the founding documents, strange as it may seem. They study basically case law, which is interpretations of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment has been manipulated and interpreted in many ways, and that's what constitutional law is. There's only about 3 colleges that I'm aware of in the nation anymore that actually have courses on the founding documents. Hillsdale is one of them, Claremont McKenna, and that's about it. Patrick Henry, of course, I almost forgot. Exactly, right. And actually there's a law in the California Education Code, believe it or not, that says before receiving a high school diploma, students are supposed to have read and understood the Constitution, the Declaration, George Washington's farewell address, and selections from the Federalist Papers. And I've yet to meet a high school student in California that's done that. I have not met one yet. So it's on the books, it's not being enforced, and so perhaps that could be a ministry for someone in this class to help further that cause. The law is there, just not being enforced or used. Okay? And so that's why I've started this ministry. It's my passion. My profession is to teach physics and to engineer, but my passion is to do this. And I truly believe that's the way the founding fathers wanted it. This is a form of public service. Okay? And to me, it's another way of serving the Lord. Because the good news is the victory has already been won. And that happened 2,000 years ago by virtue, of course, the Savior. Both physical, he is the author of both physical and spiritual liberty. And he wants us to have that liberty, both physical and spiritual. And that's why he's blessed this nation with the founding documents. I believe these are divinely inspired documents. And they're tools with which he wants us to use to maintain the liberties he's given us. Okay? And we can't use them if we don't read them and if we don't understand them. And that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, is to help further that effort to educate Americans on their founding documents. Okay? Let me go ahead and begin. What I'd like to do is give you kind of an overview of the founding documents. Most of this is probably a refresher for you. Perhaps I will speak about a few things that may have been a little bit of a different perspective for you. This country right now, in order to get back to where we need to do to restore our constitutional republic, there has to be a form of a revolution. I'm not talking about a violent revolution. I'm not talking about that at all. I'm talking about a peaceful revolution based on the founding documents. The violent revolution happened over 200 years ago. And now we're blessed with the tools to have another revolution, because there's been so many departures from our founding documents. It's really a mindset that we have to change, a basic understanding that has to be changed to restore our republic. I'm also a believer that that there's so many things that need to be done. There's so many things that have gone awry that it seems to be overwhelming sometimes. But I also believe that God will inspire each one of you and move each one of you to use whatever gifts you have, your specific gifts, to do some part of this work, however great or small it might be. And that's all that's required. John Adams once said, duty is ours and results are God's. Okay? And that's all we can do. As long as we know as we're doing what the Lord wants us to do, then we should be content and at peace, no matter what happens. Okay? All right, good. Now, so what I'd like to do now is to go ahead and kind of build a foundation of the founding documents and give an overview, and then we'll have some time for some questions and answers. I'm also a believer that the Constitution, founding documents, have the answers to the federal issues that we are seeing today. All the answers are found in the founding documents, if we would just read them and understand them. Okay? All right. First, let me show you my book here. Actually, it's a guide. This guide, as I mentioned, is a result of teaching it to my children and teaching it to other groups and refining the process. And it's not a book, it's a guide, because it doesn't take the reader away from the primary source documents. It takes the reader to the primary source documents. And the technique I use are the learning techniques, the powerful techniques of the founders. They were mostly self-taught men, and they had some very marvelous ways to acquire knowledge. And so I use those as the techniques. And I reduced it down to basically 6 documents, a matrix of 6 essential documents that give you a really good understanding of the intent and the principles in our Constitution. And you know, it's very popular today, of course, to take one clause out of context in the Constitution. So it's very important to cross-reference it to all the other writings the framers had wrote. They were very prolific writers that they wrote to make sure we understand what they did. Okay? And some people say that the Constitution is old-fashioned, antiquated, belongs in the museum, belongs in the history department. By the way, I got a political science master's degree. Do you guess what? Constitution, won't surprise you, of course, was not part of their curriculum. Wow. Wow. I was an oddball. I got it after I became converted to the Constitution. The only reason why I got it because I thought the Lord could use me as an instrument in the junior college system to teach these founding documents. And so far, that door has not opened. But that's why I went through the trouble to get that degree, as painful as it was. I was an oddball. I would talk about the Constitution, you know. I didn't fit in, but I managed to get through, and I got the paper. Okay. Anyway, so yeah, this is the matrix here of these documents, and what I'd like to do is just kind of walk you through them a little bit. On the upper left here, I put a picture of the individual that was responsible, the main architect of each document. I'm also a firm believer that God changes the world by individuals, not by governments, not by collections of individuals, okay, not by great university studies, by individuals. Okay? And so these individuals were gifted to be the major architect of these documents. Okay? And here we have James Madison. Who was he the prime architect of? I should say, what was he the prime architect of? Yes. Constitution, exactly. He wrote the Virginia Plan, and he put the skeletal framework together. Okay? And I wish his face was on more money than we do. I think we got a coin finally with his face on it. That's the first one, I think. And up top here, this man was also a good writer, had an extremely large vocabulary, as most of these men did, for not being public school taught. They had an incredible vocabulary. And he was also famous for his deeds. And here I have a picture. You can't see his picture very well, but I have a picture of him kneeling beside his horse in prayer in Valley Forge. Of course, that is. Okay. And he was also responsible for a very important document, his farewell address. After 45 years of public service, wasn't paid for that, was a professional politician, and when you read his writings, you always see he longed to get back to his farm, family, and books. But he felt that it was his duty to serve, and so he did it. That was not his profession. That was his passion was to actually serve because he felt that was his divine duty. And farewell address. Now over to the far, your right actually, is the document that was written before the Constitution. Major architect was Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, and that would be Declaration of Independence, right? Okay. And then down to the lower right, I have a man here. His name was Thomas Paine. And he was gifted to write a book that sparked the revolution. In fact, Washington, the book he wrote called what? Common Sense. So Washington had that read to his men so they would understand why they were fighting the revolution. They didn't want to fight. A lot of them thought there would be some peaceful solution. David Carroll of Carrollton, the last surviving signer, he's the one on the movie National Treasure, riding the stagecoach. When he was interviewed, he was the last one to survive. When he was interviewed, one of his comments was, we never thought, in the convention, when they signed the document, he said they never thought it would come to a war. They thought there would be some peaceful solution. They didn't want the war. They were desperate. They needed to do something, and that was the last resort. Okay? And Thomas Paine wrote a wonderful book, short book, that contains it speaks the heart and soul of the colonists and why they did what they did. And now down in the middle here, this man was quite controversial, and he still is today. He was kind of a mix of gifts, and some things he did weren't that stellar. Alexander Hamilton, which book was he the major contributor of? The Federalist Papers, okay? He and two others wrote them, James Madison and John Jay. 85 essays printed in the New York newspapers. Anybody ever read those? Difficult reading, long sentences, huge vocabulary, and those were newspaper articles. What does that tell us about the literacy rate in those days compared to now? Anyway, these actually are 85 essays that are a commentary, almost clause by clause, on the meaning of the Constitution, written by the men who wrote and voted on the Constitution. Okay? And over here is a latecomer. Frenchman, he's a French aristocrat. 1830, he and his companion Beaumont came to America to figure out what makes us tick. Who was that? Alexis de Tocqueville, okay? Democracy in America, okay? You see, the Europeans thought we were a big joke. They thought it was impossible for any country, especially as big as we were even then, to govern itself. That's ridiculous. You need a central control. You need a monarch. And so they said, well, let them do their thing over there. And within a few years, it'll disintegrate into anarchy, and we'll come over and take it back over. 50 years later, we were still going strong, stronger than they ever believed. And de Tocqueville came over to find out what makes us tick. He was like he didn't have any degree in any kind of social science degree or anything like that, but he was a very gifted man. He was a deep analyst, and he understood how to analyze society. So he came to America and interviewed all strata of our society, from the slaves to the Indians to the governor, the officials, public servants, the commoner, and he traveled throughout a lot of the cities of the United States. He wanted to find out what makes us tick, and guess what he found? He traced it back like a scientist. He was almost like a scientist that was coming into a laboratory to inspect the experiment, the petri dish, so to speak, okay? And he came and he said, okay, I think I found it. He found it at Plymouth Rock. What happened to Plymouth Rock that was so important? Pilgrims wrote what? The first American Constitution. It was the Mayflower Compact, right? Okay? And he said, this is really what these people are all about. He said, the miracle of this republic is that these people govern their governments by constitutions, by written constitutions, and they govern their lives by the written word of God. That's it right there. That was his discovery. Amazing man. I Unfortunately, the most popular version of his work, paperback, has been very abridged, and all the good stuff's been taken out. So it's important to get a better copy, and I do have a good copy, a good translation at my booth over there in the back, in the lobby. Okay, so these are the basic matrix of 6 that I believe that will be a good place to start to get a good understanding of the founding principles. Okay, so now let's go back a little bit, and let's go back here now to first the Declaration. The Declaration, in many ways, is like our national birth certificate. It really is the birth of our nation. It really birthed our nation. Most nations don't have a document like that. Most nations mark their beginning with a battle or a war of some type. France, what is it? Bastille Day, the beheading of the king. Mexico, I think, is Cinco de Mayo. But here, do we mark our birthday with a battle or a document? A document, right? In fact, do anybody in here even know when the Revolutionary War ended? We don't pay attention to that, do we? Yeah, October, I think, 9th, sometime like that. But why is that? Why do we mark our date with a document and not a battle? Ever think about that? Yes.
Well, I mean, we kind of have both because, I mean, they're always shooting out fireworks, which would stimulate a battle.
That's the modern version of how we celebrate it. Back in those days, you know how they celebrated the 4th of July? They read in public the Declaration of Independence. That was what they did. See that anymore? No. I wish that would change too. Now let's take a look. What I'd like to... Oh, you had a comment? Yes.
George Putnam has read the Declaration. He is a newsman on the radio.
Oh, good. He did that.
Yes.
Excellent, excellent. But we mark our birthday with a document because our government and our country is based on basic principles. It's basic philosophical principles that we should all... That's our birth certificate. That's our identity. And what a beautiful document it is. Let's take a quick look at it. And see, I have copies of it right here. In fact, I'm going to kind of make this kind of like a working meeting. I'm going to make you work. I'm not going to do all the work. Now, if I was to do this document, I would have put the Declaration first, but I didn't, so this is the way it is. Declaration is the back. You see, the Declaration contains the doctrine of government. The Constitution is the application of that doctrine. The Declaration and the Constitution are inseparable. It's like, if you just read the Constitution by itself, it's like not getting the main meal. It's like eating, it's part of the meal, okay? And so the Declaration is the promise, and the Constitution is the fulfillment of that promise. It's not taught that way anymore, unfortunately. The Declaration should be part of our organic law, respected both by educators and by statesmen and by jurists. You seldom see a case anymore that refers to the Declaration. It should. In fact, the framers even considered putting the Declaration as part of the Constitution. They didn't do that, though, because it was already done. It was signed, done deal. So the best thing they could do was refer to it in the Constitution. So it's referenced in Article 6, Article 7, the Constitution. Okay? That's very important to understand that. And now if you look at the Declaration, you'll see why it's such a beautiful document. Okay? The preamble. The first 2 paragraphs of the Declaration, you might have a pen, if you have a pen handy, you might want to bracket the first 2 paragraphs as the preamble to the Declaration. This contains much of the basic doctrine of government. Okay, that was embedded in the Constitution. This is the blueprint for the Constitution. Okay? All right, and most of you, in fact, many of you have this memorized. Okay, first paragraph. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which, important line here, underline this, laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. Laws of nature and laws of nature's God. So what authority did Jefferson have to go out against his legal king, the King George. This is what he had. This is what he said. I'm justified. This is my authority right here. Laws of nature and laws of nature's God. This is the foundation for all law. And what does this mean? Laws of nature were all the laws of the universe that were discoverable by man. Physics, geography, sociology, all this stuff that God allows man to discover. Okay? The laws of nature's God, what? The revealed word, right? The things that God reveals to us in the Holy Scriptures. That's the foundation of all law. So they're just right there, though. I mean, our basic birth certificate that says the basis of all law is laws of nature and laws of nature's God. What a wonderful birth certificate. Incredible. How many laws has Congress made that go against the foundation of all law? Several. Okay. This document used to be used in Congress as a reference point back over 100 years ago or more. You'd read the congressional record and you'd see these guys quoting from the Constitution and sometimes the Declaration. Nowadays, no. You're lucky to hear it talked about maybe every 10 years as somebody having it in their pocket in Congress, okay? Almost like a token, unfortunately. And you think about it too, the public servants will not begin to appreciate and desire to understand these documents until they realize the people do. Case in point, I went to a candidacy meeting several years ago for Darrell Issa down in Southern California, or I mean down in the Vista area. And I went to one of his meetings, and I came with my copy of the Constitution, and I had some questions for him, and I quoted some articles and some amendments in the Constitution, and he was getting jittery. He was uncomfortable. I could tell he didn't really know what I was talking about. You know what? Next time he went to a candidacy meeting, he had one of these in his pocket. Okay? Okay. So they're not going to care until they know we care. Okay? All right. Now let's go back to this beautiful stuff here. Okay, now look at the second paragraph here. This is also a very common misunderstanding that's right in our birth certificate. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator, okay, with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, right? Okay. So do rights come from governments? No. Nope. Come from God, right? They're divine. Yeah, the divine origin. They're sacred, right? And the founders understood this. Do you know that the word right does not appear in the body of the Constitution? It talks about privileges and immunities, which those can be bestowed by governments, right? Okay, but not rights. It's because the Constitution hearkened to the Declaration as the definition of rights. Okay? The Constitution was not meant to control the people. It was meant to control the government. Okay? And the only purpose of government is to secure these rights, these divine rights, not to create the rights, not to manipulate these rights, okay? But just to secure and protect these rights. And if we go a little further, we see that, okay? And then, of course, the next sentence there, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. That's the purpose, right? Deriving their just powers from the, what? Consent of the governed. That was a radical philosophy in those days. That was a dangerous philosophy. Kings hated that. Governments hated that in those days. Anybody going around saying that could be killed very easily. Still hate it. John Locke was in, yeah. These men were in danger of being accused of treason. The most serious crime known to men in those days, okay? And treason, of course, is, by definition, is anything the king says you are guilty of, basically, right? Okay? And treason is such an exploited thing by governments throughout history that the framers also chose to define treason in Article 3. Okay, that's the only crime that's defined in the Constitution, because it was such a dangerous thing that was easily exploited. The framers wanted to nail that down to make sure it would not be exploited again. Okay? All right. I'll to abolish it. Okay, and then we can go further, but in the interest of time. Now turn the page, and now you'll see where it begins with he has refused. Okay, you'll see a bunch of he's, and then you'll see some fours, and if you count them all up, there's 27 of them. And these are the 27 abuses perpetrated on the colonists by the King of England. Okay? And the interesting thing is, though, if you go through each one of these abuses, you find these abuses to be folded in to the Constitution as protections. That's a great way to study this document, by the way, is to blueprint it or to reference it to the Constitution. Each abuse, it was almost like the adversity that we suffered as a nation became sweet, became a benefit, became a protection for us. And that's something that happens in our lives sometimes, right? We go through adversity and we find a sweetness to it, a strength that comes out of it. Well, that's what happened here. Those abuses actually had a purpose, as distasteful as they were to the colonists. Okay? They benefited generations thereafter. Okay? Okay, now if you turn the page again, and you'll see the last two paragraphs of the Declaration. The second to last paragraph, actually, second to last paragraph is the petitions. This is a testimonial that the framers did not want war. They tried for 10 years to peacefully petition the king to hold back, to undo what he was doing, to cease his tyranny. Okay? They even actually petitioned the citizens of Ireland too, to try to get their king to change. And then we find the last paragraph, which is the actual declaration itself. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, appealing to the supreme, what? Judge of the world. Who would that be? Okay. And look at this. For the rectitude of our intentions, it doesn't say for our actions. These men were believers. They believed that we would be judged not just for our actions, but also by our thoughts and our words. Okay? So they say intentions. And now if you go ahead and go all the way down to the bottom, so we're kind of running short on time here. Last sentence, and with the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, not reliance on divine providence, not on United Nations, not on NAU, divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Signed by 56 men, and they indeed did follow through with their sacrifice. Some of them sacrificed more than others. Some of them did sacrifice their lives and their fortunes. Those who did not sacrificed their time, like Washington. They all made some sacrifice. And what a testimonial that is. That, to me alone, tells me how great this document is. That 56 great men were willing to do that for that sacrifice that for this document. And you read it and you find out why. Okay, so that's the Declaration. It's an important foundation to our Constitution. Okay? And let's see now, how am I doing on time? I think I'm, okay.
Good.
How many? 20 minutes, okay, good. Now let's go ahead and proceed. Let's do this now. Let's read a little bit of, let's do this. Common Sense, Thomas Paine. Okay.
Good.
As I mentioned before, his words were electrifying to the colonists, and when you read them, you find out why. Let me go ahead and read a little bit from what he wrote. Okay. Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. In its worst state, an intolerable one. For when we suffer or are exposed to the same miseries by a government, which we might expect in a country without a government, our calamities is heightened by reflecting that we furnish the means by which we suffer. Sound familiar? Okay. And so he thought, these men looked at government as a necessary evil. And furthermore, government, like dress, is the badge of lost innocence. the palaces of kings are built on the ruins of the bowers of paradise. For were the impulses of conscience clear, uniform, and irresistibly obeyed, man would need no other lawgiver. But that not being the case, he finds it necessary to surrender up a part of his property to furnish the means for protecting the rest. Okay? So, it looked at government as a necessary evil and a badge of lost innocence. And so, to them, having a big government was something to be ashamed of, not something to be proud of. In fact, Madison, I like to, as an engineer, I like to draw diagrams and to describe abstract ideas. So let me go ahead and indulge a little bit here. Maybe this will help communicate. Hey, okay. If we draw a diagram here, say an oval here, to represent total government. Okay. These men believe that government of anything, like a state or a city or even a family or a nation, was comprised basically of two parts. Okay. There's internal government. Whoops. And external. External government is government by force. Internal government is government by conscience. Conscience. I hope I got that right. Maybe I didn't. Okay. So, external government is governed by force and internal by conscience. And they believe that this is self-government. And this is the ideal form of government. Okay? And when you have a case, extreme case here, let's go ahead and do another one right here. Suppose we have a case of a prison. You have a lopsided situation here where most of it, you have a very little sliver of internal, and you have to have a large sliver of external to protect them from themselves, from killing each other, right? Basically, to help them protect their own life, liberty, right? The opposite extreme, which the framers created under the Constitution, was this. They believed that we had, as a nation, a large fraction of internal, and so we just needed a small sliver of external. Okay? We were mostly a self-governing people. We could take care of ourselves. We realized that governments, this is the best way to secure liberty. This is the prime way to secure liberty when you have a self-governing society, because otherwise if you have an external form of government, see, external government, which we call government today, is really force. That's what it is. It has to be, right? Because in order to protect life, liberty, and property, you have to have a policeman around. Somebody that has a force instrument to protect somebody else, right? And so the thing that people forget today is that government is force. So every time government takes something, every time government gives something to somebody, that means it has to take something from somebody else. Okay? Is that charity? No. That's not charity. Is that benevolence? No. What did the Good Samaritan do? Did he take something to somebody else and give it to the guy on the highway? No. It's not what Christ taught, right? It's not charity. It's just legalized thievery is what it is, right? Okay? And so that's what government is. It's force, okay? And we always want to have very little of it. And so when de Tocqueville came to America, he saw the thing that surprised him so much. He came to America and he looked for this grand palace. He thought the governor of New York would be in a big palace or something, a castle or a chateau. Didn't see that. He lived in a common house. Okay? Because our republic was fueled by a lot of self-government. When somebody wanted something done, this is something else that surprised him. When somebody wants something done, like, for instance, the Temperance Society was very popular in those days to help people with the drinking problem. In France, he realized that if somebody got something done, they would go to the government to create a program. In America, he was shocked because the people did it themselves. These people that started creating these societies out of nowhere to solve problems. He just marveled at the amount of self-government that we had in those days. Okay? So, and that's what Thomas Paine meant when he penned that paragraph in Common Sense. And this is how they looked at government. Okay? And so let me make this suggestion to you, and let me make sure I say it right. We hear a lot about patriotism these days, right? Patriotism. What really is patriotism? We know that throughout history, patriotism has been exploited and counterfeited by potentates, by tyrants, right? It's very easy for a king or a tyrant to call someone treasonous because they're not being patriotic. Correct? And that's happened throughout history. Is it happening today?
Yeah.
I'd say that it is. So let me subscribe to you perhaps another definition of patriotism that might be a more durable form, a more reliable form, less likely to be exploited or deceived with. What if I told you that patriotism really is a love of liberty? I mean, it's nice. The fireworks are nice, okay? Don't get me wrong, okay? And the military, I mean, okay? And all that's nice, okay? But it can be exploited, especially the military, correct?
Yes.
I mean, for instance, in Germany, Hitler did that big time, right? He connected patriotism with the military, okay? And I'm not trying to degrade anybody that served in the service. I give them, I admire what they did, and I appreciate what they did, okay? I'm just saying that the best kind of patriotism is a love of liberty in these written documents. Now, that can't be exploited. It's written down. Right? I subscribe that's the true form of patriotism, okay? And I believe that God has given us these documents. They're divine documents. And when much is given, much is required, right? And He expects us to use them. He expects us to become a beacon to the nations by example, not by weaponry, but by principle. Hear the story of Greg Mortensen? Anybody? It's a book called 3 Cups of Tea. He's taken it upon himself, all charitably done, no government aid whatsoever, to build schools in Pakistan and Afghanistan to educate the children. Okay? I subscribe he's doing more over there than our military is. Okay? And that's what I'm talking about. Principle-based freedom. Freedom by persuasion, not by coercion. Okay? And if these principles are true, they will stand up to any falsehood. That's how we win, is by understanding these principles and teaching them. And those who are open-minded will resonate with these things. We've seen this happen already. As I mentioned before, with Ron Paul, I never thought there would be so many liberty-loving people in this country, that this came out of nowhere, okay, when he started teaching these principles, okay? And that's how it works. Those who are open-minded, even a little bit, and they hear these principles, they just ring true. They can't deny them. And that's our greatest weapon. That's our greatest weapon against communism also. Better than any kind of military weapon. If we taught these principles and understood them, we would revolutionize this country and this world. Amen. And I testify to you that these documents are divine. They came from the Lord. Okay? These men were inspired. They're like Scripture. Okay? Okay, good. I think I've probably, okay, I'm just about unfortunately done here. Let's go ahead, and before I launch onto another, I had so much more I wanted to talk, oh well. Okay, let's go ahead and take a few moments now for questions you might have. Yes. Okay, yes.
Yeah, my name's Gary, and I've heard, and maybe a misperception, but I understand the Federalist Papers were a group of people who didn't like a lot of, they liked central government.
Yes.
The Anti-Federalists did not like a central government, but I see in your brochure that you don't have anything on the Anti-Federalist Papers, so I'm thinking maybe there's a misconception on my part. So could you
Yes.
explain
Certainly.
between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists?
Yes. The Federalist Papers really were written, the purpose of they were for them was to persuade the citizens of New York to ratify the Constitution. Because you see, after the Constitution was signed by 39 men, it had to be ratified. Because remember what the Declaration says? This is the government by the consent of the governed, right? So there's no way that it would have been enforced or imposed on the states without their ratification. Okay? And there were a few states that were reluctant, and New York was one of them. The governor there was Clinton, interestingly enough. Okay. And and it was a tall order to persuade the delegates from New York to vote for the Constitution. Okay, and so these three men wrote these articles to persuade New York. And yes, they were. See, the Anti-Federalists were like, for instance, Patrick Henry was one of the most prominent Anti-Federalists. Okay, and their beef was that it's too much government too soon. We just got rid of this tyrant. Now let's not go back that direction. Let's wait a little bit longer to see how things play out, and then we'll perhaps make a central government. Okay, that was kind of their opinion. And so the Anti-Federalist Papers were written to oppose having that much central government. The two of the biggest gripes that Anti-Federalists had was they didn't like the idea of having a federal judiciary, Supreme Court. They thought that was too much power for the court. Okay, and they also didn't like the idea of having any even little inkling of direct taxation in the document. Okay, there's a little bit of it in there. They didn't like that in there at all. Okay, and we saw how that's been exploited too. I don't put it in my. They're actually referenced in my book, but I had to reduce it down. See, my book is designed to take the reader to the essentials, and they can go further as they pursue. I don't want to give too much all at once and perhaps discourage the typical reader. But yes, those are important. That's an important document. Okay.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm from Oceanside, so I'm
Yes.
pretty close to you.
Yeah.
One question probably everyone has, everyone probably will have, is what's the difference between the working and the living?
Oh yeah.
Constitution?
I almost forgot.
So is that.
That's the title of my talk, isn't it? How can I forget that? Okay. All right. Okay. Living Constitution is a phrase the Supreme Court has used. I think some of you are familiar with that. I can't remember the name of the justice that started that phrase. What they mean by that is that it's an amorphous, changing, relative document. It changes like a flag in the wind, whichever direction the wind's blowing, okay? And they just look at it that way. They don't look at it as a literal document. Look at it as something that's nice to reference once in a while. Sometimes they'll reference the Code of Hammurabi, sometimes a European policy statement, whatever kind of thing. It's just so weird, I can't even barely say it. But to me, it's not a living document. It's a working document. What I mean by that is it can solve problems today. It's amazing because it's not a museum piece because it's not technology dependent. What it was written for was to address human nature. Has human nature changed over the last 200 years? Are we still just as susceptible to corruption and greed as we were 200 years ago? Absolutely, right? So it's a timeless document. And so I say it's not a living document, it's a working document. It can solve today's problems. We just understand it. Okay? Yes?
I like to add to that when I do classes and stuff on this myself.
Yeah.
The fact that people often confuse the advances in technology with the unchanging nature of human beings. What has changed today, and would make the founders' heads swim, is the ability of leaders, potentially corrupt leaders, to know, to control, and to destroy. And because they have almost untouched and unheard of abilities to do those three things,
Yes.
that document is much more important today than it was back in the
Amen to that. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. And one of the best instrument, one of the most tyrannical instruments that has been used over the past over 80 years is the Federal Reserve. And that's a whole other topic, but that basically, and just a basic statement here, that system, that flawed monetary system, has given the government endless resources and money to do whatever they want. And whenever the Federal Reserve prints up money, you know what that does to our money? It debases our currency. It dilutes our currency. It's like a hidden tax on this whole nation. How subtle. How subtle. We're a debt-based economy. We're not a savings-based economy. We're debt-based. You can't even teach your children to save money anymore because you put money in the bank, inflation knocks it out, right? It's because we have this deeply flawed Federal Reserve System. The framers give us that? No. It's a departure again from the Constitution. Constitution teaches specifically a gold-based system. If you think about it, gold's the only way to have a unexploitable monetary system. Almost unexploitable, okay? Almost completely, okay? And if we had that, we would have savings instead of debt. The dollar is in serious condition. The dollar is going to fail. It can't take this much pressure. Every time you get an Economic Recovery Act, where does that money come from? The money we get. It's printed up. It's fiat money. It debases everybody else's currency. And so it's inevitable. Unless we can somehow turn that monetary system around, the dollar is doomed.
Before we do that, let's thank him for coming this evening.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you.